Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to talk about the books I read this year. I upped my reading a lot, and I plan on making a video telling you guys how I did that, some tricks I used to read more books than ever, which is because this is the most books I've read in a year. I read 40 as opposed to last year's 15. I have learned a lot about reading. I have learned a lot from the things I have read. I've had a lot of fun. It feels really good to read this many books, and it's very fulfilling. I don't think I can really describe how fulfilling it is to read this many books. It's not quite the same as playing video games or watching movies and stuff like that, right? It doesn't have the same kind of bragging power that reading a lot of books does, which means, yes, I will brag just a little bit, because I can take a little pride in myself. I read a lot of books, and they were good books. Most of them. I don't think I really read an outright terrible book this year. I'm pretty good about not doing that. Starting off, we have War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is a reread. I have read this book a few times. It is one of my favorite books of all time. I think it is one of the absolute best survival horror stories ever written. I think this book is a masterpiece. I think almost everything about it is perfect. It's not that it has the most complex characters or it has the most deep themes in any book that you'll ever read. It's just a really approachable read. It's just so unique. A alien invasion story, but set like a pre-World War I Europe. And that's what makes this book so interesting, is that we get to see like crude World War I technology go up against aliens who only have like slightly more advanced technology. This is one thing I think a lot of the adaptations miss, is that they usually just put it in the modern day, or they, it's like, yeah, but what makes War of the Worlds interesting is that it's not in the modern day. I want it set in London, and I would like to see a version of this that isn't pre-World War I Europe. The one thing I really like about H.G. Wells' style, though, is how vivid his descriptions are, how powerful he makes the Martian tripods seem. That's why I think this is a survival horror book, because there is no grand epic battle. There are no heroes that stand up against the aliens and defeat them, except maybe the Thunderchild. This really isn't a thing that happens in this book. This is about just not dying. That's all this is. This is about a guy hiding in places, hoping the aliens do not find him. That is the entire book. My favorite chapters of the book are the ones where it transfers over to his brother's perspective, and we get to see what's happening in the bigger cities, and what's happening in London in particular, as people are desperate to get away from the alien hordes, going so far as to kill each other just to escape death. This book, it does not read like a lot of the other drier classics you might have read, like in high school or something like that. It doesn't read like that at all. You would think it would, but it doesn't. War of the Worlds is a borderline perfect book. It is perfect in terms of atmosphere and the really just visceral horror. Second book I read this year was Beowulf. What started me started in Beowulf is at the beginning of the year, when I had a few things going on in my life and I decided to kind of start over and try to get on self-improvement and try to make myself a better man. I started yearning for that kind of art. The art that had really heroic men just doing heroic things. That's what I wanted out of my art at the time, and I still have a thirst for it. That's the kind of characters I want to write. I want to write men who are unapologetically masculine, but are also morally good, go out and they save and protect people because it's the right thing to do. Not because they have any kind of personal connection to them, not because they have any kind of goal that we don't see. It's because protecting them is the right thing to do, right? I don't really see that a lot. A lot of heroes nowadays are very selfish. They're just not good people. And Beowulf is like pure classic epic hero. Right up there with Gilgamesh. He hates Grendel not because Grendel killed his dog or Grendel, did something to him that was personal. He wants to kill Grendel because Grendel is killing people. It's that simple. Watching it's really interesting. People would probably see Beowulf as a two-dimensional character, but in my opinion, we've had so much attempts at trying to make characters gray and three-dimensional, and that's not to dismiss or downplay actual three-dimensional characters in fiction. But I think it's kind of interesting to go back to this old, 2D character of where good is good and bad is bad, and the character hates evil so much that he wants to ride out and kill it. I think that's kind of cool, in my opinion. I would like to see more stuff like that. Obviously, Beowulf is a timeless classic. Tolkien, when he translated it with the help of his son Christopher, he tried to write it in narrative prose instead of the epic poem like the original format is. So if you buy any other format, it's going to be in poem. But this one reads like a novel. He wrote it like it was prose. You can definitely tell Tolkien was influenced by this story in particular when writing Lord of the Rings, particularly the more Norse elements of it, like with the Rohirrim and the Rohan, the titles they have, some of the history, some of the lore. I think even in this book, I think Middle Earth is literally referenced in Beowulf. I could be wrong. It's like 100 pages long. The rest of this right here is just like commentary about Beowulf and some other things and notes that Tolkien had regarding Beowulf and stuff. So if you're a Tolkien fan, obviously get this, because it's got some interesting things about him and his son, some of his speeches and lectures and stuff relating to Beowulf and the classic hero. Beowulf is a really cool character, and I would like to see a return to classic heroism like that. Maybe not, you could argue not as two-dimensional, but just evil is evil, and we have to ride out and stop it. Next on our list is a non-fiction book called Empire of the Summer Moon, a book about Quanah Parker and the rise and the fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history. Now, this book is one of the very best books I've read this year. It is certainly, I don't know if it's better than Apache Wars that I read last year, but it might be. It's definitely the best book I've read so far about the American Indian. The Comanche are really fascinating, and the way S.C. Gwynedd portrays them is extremely honest. He's noticed their kind of misogynistic behaviors, their more violent tendencies and stuff like that, but he also gives them credit when they're noble. He criticizes everyone fairly in this book, no matter what color they are, and there's just a lot of really fascinating information here about Quanah Parker, about his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, who was white, who was kidnapped when she was young. The Comanche are certainly among the more interesting Native American groups out there, not to insult any of the other ones, but in my personal opinion, I think the Comanche are like a plethora of opportunities for storytelling, and not just to portray them as the villains either. It's like to actually, well, I don't want to give too much away, but my intentions are. But I think the Comanche are really interesting. This book does a really great job breaking down their story from their rise when Spain arrived in the early days of America to their fall in the mid-1870s when Quanah Parker surrendered. Great book. Highly recommend. Next is EntreLeadership by Dave Ramsey. I believe I read a Dave Ramsey book last year. I'd have to go back and look again. It was Financial Peace, which is his most iconic one. But EntreLeadership is essentially a book about how to be an entrepreneur and a leader, because you need to be both in order to have an effective business. Not only just an effective business, but a moral one. It teaches you how to discipline workers. It teaches you how to be humble, but also be firm. Things like that. There's good leadership advice, good entrepreneurial and financial advice. Obviously there is, because it's Dave Ramsey being an entrepreneur and a financial advisor himself. I would say it's a pretty good book. A lot of the things I really can't describe unless you read it yourself. It's kind of a self-help book. Helps with goal setting, setting up a mission statement, setting up things that would help the company stay focused on a singular mission, what kind of workers you should hire, stuff like that. Next book that I read this year was Atomic Habbits by James Clear. The book doesn't approach goal setting the way that most other books do. The biggest lesson you can learn from this book, as you can see if you zoom in, you can see the letters are made out of individual little dots. Those are atoms. Let's say you want to start exercising and you do really complicated workouts and you end up tiring yourself out and burning yourself out within the first day, and then you just don't work out for the rest of the year. To keep that from happening, perhaps you shouldn't do that. James Clear suggests perhaps you should start small. Do a couple of workouts. Do some push-ups. Do some sit-ups. Go for a walk. Something like that, and gradually get harder as you go. So that way, the atomic habits build up, combine, and eventually create something bigger, and you have an atomic habit established. Applies to work, applies to life. There's a lot of things in this book that the atomic habit structure can apply to. Highly recommend. It's like an 8 out of 10. Next book on the list is the sequel to Way of Kings, the second book in the Stormlight Archives series, Words of Radiance. The Way of Kings was the best book I'd read in a long time, one of the best books I'd ever read. I called it one of the best because I wasn't quite sure if it was the absolute best. That's not the case with Words of Radiance, because it is just the best book I've read in a long time. It's literally a 10. In my heart, it's a 10. I have never read a book that made me feel so many emotions, all the emotions that a good book should make you feel. This book does. Of course, it has this many pages to do so. It's like a 1,300-page chunker, just like the rest of the Stormlight Archive books are. It is literally my favorite book ever. Words of Radiance is my favorite book ever. There is not a fiction book that I currently love more than Words of Radiance. If you love storytelling and you love big epic fantasy stuff and you're tired of perhaps some of the trends and some of the bad storytelling that we've been getting lately through the media, just read this. Read these books. They're excellent. Every single one of them. All of them are great. This one's the best one, though. I love this one to death. There's so many great character payoffs, great character writing. It's literally perfect. I love it. Next book on the list was Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey, a book that is not perfect. I heard a lot of good things about this book. I saw Matthew McConaughey went on Jordan Peterson's podcast and did an interview with him because of this book, and that kind of got me interested in it. It's not terrible. I don't love it either. Green Lights is supposed to almost be like a half biography, half self-help book, right? It's basically just him going over things that happened in his life and trying to give lessons. And some of the lessons are good. Some of the lessons are just strange. Matthew McConaughey is a bit more of a hippie than I thought he would be. I'm not, like, the most familiar with his work. I only, like, got this book because other people told me the book was great. But his book is, like, kind of mid. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I like some of the lessons in there. There was a couple of times I found myself being like, oh, I agree with that. And there's a couple of times, like, follow your wet dreams. What does that mean? Like, I know he explains it in the book, but, like, I'm sorry, like, Ryan Holiday, I respect you, but I don't agree that this book is good. I think a lot of the lessons in it are just kind of mid. It just comes down as just redneck hippie wisdom at the end of the day. There's another book I've actually read this year that I think it's literally up next. No, it's one of the books that's up next. That does the same thing way better, and we'll talk about it. This book is like a 6 for me. Green Lights is one of my least favorite books, if not my least favorite book of the year. Was not a big fan. Was pretty disappointed by it. Next book on our list is a book I do not have a copy of. I listened to the audiobook of it, which, yes, counts as reading. I will not hear otherwise. The next book on our list is Cybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. It is probably the best self-improvement book ever written. Don't know that it's ever going to be topped, probably ever, which kind of made it where the rest of the great self-help books that I read, self-improvement, I don't like saying self-help because it's like almost a negative connotation. Some of the, like, a lot of these books were suggested by Hamza, and I kind of wish I didn't read Maxwell Maltz's work first, because it made the other ones weak in comparison, even the really good ones. Because Maxwell Maltz's stuff is just on a whole nother level, and it just really just opens up your mind to being like, I never thought of it that way. Which is kind of the point, because you're supposed to think of it in a new way. You know, just the idea that, hey, instead of telling yourself, hey, I'm going to go out and I'm going to exercise this year, why don't you just, in your mind, change who you are in your mind and just say, I'm an athlete, so I'm going to eat like an athlete, I'm going to work out and train like an athlete, and I'm going to behave like an athlete. Stop saying you're going to read books and say that I'm a reader. Like, things like that will completely change your mindset. And he gives really interesting information on why this does that and why these psychological tricks work. And it kind of blows you away. It's almost too good to be true, and then you try it, and you're like, holy crap, this actually works. It actually works. Read Cybernetics. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but read it. It's free on YouTube. It should be. If it is, I'll put the link in the description because it's a fantastic book. Would highly recommend. The next book on the list is the book that I alluded to, and that book is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Now, this is the book that I alluded to earlier when I was talking about Matthew McConaughey's book, where it's like a half self-improvement, half biography, or autobiography. But I think this one's much better. I think this one's a lot better, and that's funny thing is because you wouldn't really think it would be. David Goggins just doesn't seem like the kind of person to write a book like Matthew McConaughey seems like he would, right? You wouldn't be surprised that Matthew McConaughey would write a book, but you'd be kind of surprised that David Goggins did. I don't know if he had the help of a ghostwriter. Regardless, this book is very, like, I think David Goggins has described it as a real, raw book. That's the good way to explain it. It's raw. It's real. He's a very intense guy. If you know anything about David Goggins, you've probably seen memes, you've probably seen him jogging on the internet, which is one of the reasons I was able to lose 90 pounds in a year, was because of reading this book and thinking to myself, is this really the farthest I can push myself? I feel like I can go just a little bit farther. And that's probably the biggest lesson you're going to learn from this. Can't Hurt Me is about basically taking pain in your life and suffering and using it as fuel to make yourself better. Never being satisfied with where you are and constantly wanting more and constantly going out and getting it. Instead of sitting there complaining, well, I can't do this, making excuses and saying that, I'm not capable. Just shutting up, biting the bullet, and just going for it. It doesn't matter that if you're like one of the best athletes in the world, you could always be a little better. It doesn't matter any of these things. It doesn't matter what position you're in. You can do better. You can get yourself up and you can do better. You can. There is a better life. There is no excuse that you can make that's going to change that. It doesn't matter what you've gone through. It doesn't matter what you've seen. It doesn't matter what you've suffered. You can do better. You can get up and you can do better. And David Goggins really captures that in this book. Biographical parts are kind of harrowing. Some parts are very shocking. If you're not into like really depressing, dark kind of stuff, I don't know if I recommend this book for you. If you're not like a fan of like strong language and stuff, I would obviously not recommend this book because it's, you know, David Goggins, Navy SEAL, who doesn't have a filter. But it's a great book. I would say it's like a strong 8 out of 10. There's some points in it that I don't agree with, but it's not to the like extent where I just like read a point in Matthew McConaughey's book, and the more I think about it, the less it makes sense. I wouldn't say that about Can't Hurt Me. Can't Hurt Me's got a lot of valuable information, and at the end of the day, if you read it, you don't have to go to the crazy extent David Goggins does, but you at least have to try to do better than you did last time. And that's kind of the message of the book. And yeah, for that, I would recommend reading it. The next book on the list is another book I do not have a copy of. It was a borrowed copy. Is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Overall, don't really know what I can say about Pride and Prejudice. I saw the 90s TV show, which is actually pretty fantastic. It's one of the best adaptations of a piece of literature that has ever been brought to screen, whether or not that would be TV or movie. Pride and Prejudice is just one of the best ones. Just period. The one with Colin Firth in it is fantastic. I would actually recommend it, and that's coming from someone that isn't into just like pure romance stuff. The book is pretty great too. It's a bit of a slog for me because I'm not like into the kind of style that she's writing. It's no offense to Jane Austen. I do think Jane Austen is perhaps the greatest female writer of all time. I don't think there's any females out there or otherwise that will dispute this, because I think most of them literally look up to Jane Austen as the greatest female writer of all time. Pride and Prejudice, I don't know what else I could say about it. The book is super iconic. Mr. Darcy makes a bad impression on Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet gets offended because of what Mr. Darcy says, and later finds out Mr. Darcy's kind of falling in love with her. He proposes. She says no. Yada, 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 yada. They eventually get married, happily ever after. End credits. Would I recommend? Yeah. If you're into romantic books, I would definitely say it's probably the best romantic story ever written. I haven't really read any of Jane Austen's other works, and I don't know that I will, because it's just not something I'm particularly interested in. You can still think a book is great and just not notice that it's just not for you. And I think that's how I describe Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, I'd recommend it if that's the kind of book you're into. Jane Austen is great. She deserves the kind of respect that she gets as the greatest female writer of all time, because she just is. Book number 14 was Leadership, Strategy, and Tactics by Jocko Willink. Obviously, if you're in the same kind of self-improvement circle, you have heard the name Jocko Willink being thrown around. Like David Goggins, he's an ex-Navy SEAL. This book is kind of a self-improvement book, technically, but it's more just again, like when it says Leadership, Strategy, Tactics, it's a strategy book. It's a field manual. You're supposed to take it with you, and you're supposed to read out of it and pop it open and find the page that you need and stuff like that, and you're constantly supposed to refresh yourself with leadership stuff. This book is very, very good. I like it a lot. It helped me be a better leader in circles where that was called for. It helped me be a better follower to leaders when I was put under one. It helped me to show them more respect and to try and to take over a situation and understand that the most important thing is to make sure that the team succeeds in everything. Make sure the team succeeds. Even if you have to bite the bullet on a couple of things, even if you don't agree with what the leader is saying, even if you don't agree with how it should play out, it teaches you a lot about when to be humble, when to be stern, when to be strong, how you need to humble yourself before people. And I think there's a lot of messages that kind of coincide with a lot of Christ-like themes, like doing things like, if you want to gain your men's respect, pick up trash. Don't tell them to pick up trash. Don't make it a big show that you're picking up trash. Just pick up trash. If your subordinates respect you, they will start picking up trash with you. It's kind of the idea of washing your disciples' feet, in my opinion. It's the same kind of humbling yourself to show that you're not high above all your men. You're not in this layer above them. It shows that you're one of them. You're just like them. You're getting your hands dirty too. You do not see them as dirty scoundrels not worthy to touch. You are one of them, and they will respect you and treat you more like a brother because of it. Things like that make this book very valuable, and as you can see, it's not very long. So yes, I would highly recommend reading this book. It's one of the best books I've read this year. It's easily like a 9 out of 10. It's fantastic. Book number 15 is another book I do not have a copy of, is The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. Compound Effect is very similar to Atomic Habits. In fact, you can probably read both of them back to back. It is free on YouTube if you want to check that out. Link in the description, if it is still there. But the Compound Effect kind of reiterates a lot of the points Atomic Habits make, which basically means that if you start doing small things right now, everything you do, the Compound Effect is eternal. Everything you do adds to the Compound Effect. If you're smoking, right? If you're smoking twice a day, eventually your lungs will fill up with tar and you'll die, right? eventually you will have bad lungs. Your lungs will not be as good. Your health will not be as good because it compounded over time. You save a penny every day. Eventually it compounds over time and you have a lot more money. If you make good habits and good decisions right now and you keep to them, they'll compound and they'll eventually pay off. Valuable book, pretty easy listen, so, go check that out. Next book on the list was a bit of surprise to me. It's a book by Phil Robertson called Uncanceled. As you can see, it's not very long. It's a very quick read. The point of the book is how we should respond to cancel culture, since it has become consistent as of late for everyone getting canceled for the dumbest reasons, people just not forgiving each other and just canceling them on the internet. You don't respond by canceling them back, you respond with love. You're supposed to respond in a Christ-like manner. That's what this book is about, is how to respond in a Christ-like manner when you are canceled. And even if you're not a Christian, I do think this book is valuable, especially as bad as cancel culture is getting today. And I think this book will probably stay relevant at least for a little while. Next book on the list is Stormlight Archive number 3. Yes, this is the second big chunker, almost 1,300 page book I read this year. And I will say, I really like Oathbringer. I like it a lot. It is not as good as Words of Radiance overall, but its ending is fantastic. That's probably the common consensus amongst most people that have read this book. It is a slow burn. It is not as action-packed as Words of Radiance. It doesn't have as many plot twists and turns, just bam, 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 action. Like, Words of Radiance was just nonstop. It's actually amazing how breakneck pace that massive book is. This book is very slow. Might be frustrating to readers who are just coming off that really action-packed high of Words of Radiance, but the ending is so fantastic, it makes up for it. The ending is as good as anything in Words of Radiance. The ending is basically, I can't even describe it. Like, I don't like describing the plots of the books of Brandon Sanderson's books, particularly Stormlight Archive, because there's so much that happens in a Stormlight Archive book. It's kind of hard just to break it down. Just be like, well, Kaladin does this. You really can't do that because there's so much that happens. So I would just recommend, it is still a fantastic book, especially worth you read. It's like an 8 out of 10. Still a fantastic book. It's still a great book. I would say go read it. And you won't be disappointed by it. The ending takes care of all of it. The ending is so perfect that you'll be glad you read it. You'll just be like, wow, that was so awesome. There's so many great character payoffs in that ending, so many fantastic pieces of storytelling. Brandon Sanderson knocks it out of the park. It is very clear that this is his magnum opus series that he's writing. He's putting everything he has into it, because 3 books in, and he has not missed. I have Rhythm of War, and I have a hardback version that I plan on unboxing soon. Of the entire series that's been released so far. All 3 of them are fantastic. I hope he keeps up this momentum all the way to Stormlight Archive 10. I have no idea how he's going to do it, because the books are kind of anomalies. It's actually wild how well written and how much momentum Brandon Sanderson has been able to keep up over the course of this really long series. And I'm just blown away, super impressed by the work he's been able to accomplish and the things he's been able to do with these books. It's a piece of fantasy. It's like a fantasy masterpiece. I'll just say that. They're fantastic, awesome books. Next book on my list is another religious book. It is called Unleashing the Power of the Holy Spirit by Alan Jackson. If you are Christian and you believe in the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, this book, I think, describes the concept of the Holy Spirit better than any other book I've ever seen. They are bound transcripts from Alan Jackson's sermon at his church. Pretty fantastic read. The book is extremely valuable and does help you to learn how to pray and communicate with the Holy Spirit and understand the Holy Spirit as an individual and as a piece of God, right? It helps you to understand what the Holy Spirit is, who he is, and why you want to have a relationship with him. Would recommend. It's a 9 out of 10. Next book I read was a interesting little book I saw at Sam's Club, funny enough. It's just called The Plot. I took a look at the back of it, and I was like, this actually sounds really interesting. It's a book about writing books, and that in itself, obviously has a lot of meta things in it, but the entire point of the book, it was really riveting, and Stephen King talked about how he loved how brilliantly written it was, and how it was perfect with tension, and it is. The book is really great at tension. The Plot by, I apologize for butchering her name, Jean Hanf Corlitz. I don't know. It's a great book, though. The ending is kind of depressing. It's not a happy-go-lucky book, so if you're expecting some sort of happy ending, don't. The book is extremely intense, though, and it's extremely well written, and the way tension and scenes are built up is always keeping you interested because you never have all of the info, and you want to keep reading so you can get just a little bit more, and she strings you along with it perfectly. I think this is the only book from this writer I have read. I think she's great. One of the only female writers I've read recently that I'm just like, oh wow, so this isn't like a Colleen Hoover, Stephanie Meyer trashy book. This is actually a really good book. Would recommend. The entire point of the plot is that he's down on his luck. He hasn't been able to write a successful book since his first book. He can't find any inspiration to write a plot. He is just completely he's hit writer's block big time. And his student comes up with this brilliant idea for a book, and it's so good that it blows him away. We don't get to see what it is yet. That's something we get to find out slowly. And it turns out, years later, this book is never released. He never knows what happens to the book, and he knows the book was going to be released because he knows how good of a story this was. This story had potential. He finds out the student dies and never wrote the book. So, he decides to take the idea, and he decides to publish it. Only problem is, somebody isn't happy about it and is basically vowing revenge against him for publishing this book idea because they know he stole it. So it's a really interesting book. It's really cool. It's like a solid 8 out of 10. It's a great book. It's really well written. It's just it's a book that writers especially would enjoy. Last book before I stop this recording is The Last Stand by Nathaniel Philibert. Another American Indian, Plains Indian book. This one being about the Sioux and Cheyenne, particularly during the Battle of Little Bighorn with General George Custer. It has a lot of things in it that you might not have known about Sitting Bull or George Custer, and it follows both of them right up to the Battle of Little Bighorn. What both of them were doing, what caused them to eventually be pushed together until they fought, and really just kind of just does away with a lot of the historical inaccuracies and myths that we usually hear surrounding this battle and gives you a more accurate depiction of what really happened. Great book. It's pretty fantastic. I didn't like it quite as much as Empire of the Summer Moon, but there's definitely things in here you're going to learn. There's things that I sat here and learned that I didn't know. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that's what happened. I've heard all these things about Custer and Little Bighorn that, like, from school that were just not true. They're just not true. You'll hear family, like trivia games. Did you know Custer did this? And it turns out, no, he didn't. The way people tell his story isn't quite accurate. And same thing with Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull's not quite accurate either. And both of them are much more interesting than most normal people give them credit for. I would actually recommend this book. So next up on the list, number 21, 22, 25, and 29 are all stories by Robert E. Howard. The Red Shadows, Hills of the Dead, The Footfalls Within, and Wings of the Night. All of these stories are tales of one of Robert E. Howard's most beloved and respected characters, being Solomon Kane. For those of you who don't know, he is a pulp writer who wrote short stories, serialized short stories about particular characters, namely Conan the Barbarian, Red Sonja, Cole the Conqueror, and my particular favorite being Solomon Kane. I haven't really read a lot of Conan. I was just really interested in Solomon Kane as a character because I like the idea of black and white morality and a character that just hates evil so much that he just makes it his moral mission to kill them. That's really interesting. But Solomon Kane takes this mission to a psychotic degree, right? He takes it so far. The story plays with his black and white morality in a really, all of these stories do, in a really interesting way. The story is aware of who Solomon Kane is and even calls him out on his hypocrisies, and it really pushes the limits of his morality to see how consistent he will stay to his morals. Solomon Kane is a really interesting character. He is a pilgrim that is armed with 2 sabers, 2 pistols, and a musket, and he goes out traveling the world, Africa, Britain, London. You might have seen the movie, but he travels the world hunting down evil and executing it, whether it be Muslim slave drivers, whether it be random robbers that just rob and kill people on the side of the road. And then he gets to the point where he's just hunting things down from the depths of hell itself. Now, what makes these short stories really interesting is how they're almost a perfect balance of serialized action, swashbuckling stories, kind of like what you read from Zorro, although just a slightly more brutal because Robert E. Howard has an affinity for brutality, combined with really bleak, dark fantasy. Robert E. Howard's stories are really digestible. A lot of them are free on YouTube because they're in the public domain. These stories are a lot of fun. They're really interesting. Solomon Kane has probably one of the best character intros I've seen this year. The idea that this character, he just comes across a random woman, doesn't know who she is, never met her in his life, but decides that he's going to go on a rampage and kill all those responsible for killing her. It wasn't like it was his sister. It wasn't like it was his girlfriend or his wife. It was just some random person. He's never met her, but he decides that people are going to die for it. I would recommend Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane stories. You can find them on YouTube. I'll put some links in the description. I would suggest looking up a reading list, though, because there are so many Solomon Kane stories and so many Conan stories and so many that it can be kind of hard to know which order to actually read them in, because these are like dozens of these things written over like 70 years ago. Next is another book by G. Allen Jackson, being Big Trouble Ahead. This book is a little different than Unleashing the Holy Spirit. It's essentially just kind of a warning. It's very similar to another book that we'll be mentioning on this list later by Eric Metaxas, but essentially like a harrowing warning to the Christian church, saying that there are bad things to come for believers, and we will be challenged in our beliefs, and we better be prepared to stand up for them. I would recommend this book. It's not like his last book that I've reviewed on here, where it's essentially just a bunch of sermons that are tied together in a book with some extra editing here and there. But once again, G. Allen Jackson has created another solid resource that I believe Christian believers should actually give a look, especially those that are a little worried about what is to come. And it's not a book that's just all woe and misery. It is a book that talks about why we can have hope for the big trouble that is coming to us. Would recommend. I don't have it with me because somebody is borrowing my copy, but it is a good book. Next up on the list is number 24, which is The Daybreakers by Louis L'Amour. Now, those of you who don't know, Louis L'Amour is one of the most iconic Wild West writers, other than maybe Charles Portis and a couple of others. Louis L'Amour is among the most respected and one of the most revered, so I'm having to be careful how I speak about this book. It's not a bad book, but the book is oddly written, and I'm not sure I like it. One thing I will say about Louis L'Amour's Daybreakers is that he certainly knows how to set the tone and to make you feel like you're in the Wild West. He knows how to set up a scene. Fire crackling, food cooking, the sprawling hills, and all, like, you can see all of it in your head, and Louis L'Amour does a fantastic job making you feel like you're in the great American Western frontier. There's no doubt about that. He's great at that. However, my problem with the Daybreakers, the story being told, this isn't a very long book, as you can see, but the story being told is a lot happens, and it feels like the story just kind of rushes through all of it without actually letting us sit down and develop these characters. It's like a character is just kind of talking, which is similar to a couple of other books, even similar to True Grit. True Grit does the same thing, but with True Grit, I can excuse it a little bit because True Grit is supposed to be like a personal account of the main character, telling all the things she went through with Rooster Cockburn and all of these other adventures that she went on. That's the point of that. It's supposed to be a memoir. This one feels like it's almost supposed to be a memoir, but it still is first person like a memoir, but it just kind of rushes. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain my feelings for this book. I got really mixed feelings. I like parts of it. I actually really like the main romance, oddly enough. It was pretty well written. It's the story basically follows Tyrell Sackett after he kills a man in Tennessee and has to move out to the West with his brother, and they go through all these different adventures, have there's some heated politics, kind of Godfather stuff going on, and both of them eventually become lawmen in order to preserve order out in this chaotic land that is the Great Western Frontier. It's fine. It's like a 6. It's fine. I don't think it'll waste your time. It's not very long. It's just, I wish there was just times that it would just dwell on some of the stories being told. I wish it would just sit down for just a minute and let us kind of like unravel some of these emotions inside these characters. And I think, but if you did that, this book would be like 3 times as thick, because there's so much that happens and we just kind of blaze through it. Periods of years go by, and it's in a matter of a couple of like pages, and this happens consistently. And it's just not something I'm really a fan of, and I just wished I wanted more out of this book, because I don't think it's a bad book. I just think I don't know if I want to call it rushed. And like I said, I appreciate Louis L'Amour. I actually like the fact that Louis L'Amour lived out in these places out there in the West, and he's actually traveled on foot the places where his characters go and stuff like that. And he's traveled the West, and so that's why this book does feel like an authentic Western. It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm inspired by this movie or this movie. It's like, no, I've actually, Louis L'Amour's like, he's actually been there, and to that I'll give him credit. It's an authentic book. But I just wish it would spend a little more time with some of the characters. Next book on the list is a book I don't have because it was a borrowed copy, called Martin Luther by Eric Metaxas. It is one of the best biographies I have ever read, if not one of the best nonfiction books I have ever read. It is incredibly dense and taught me a lot of things about Martin Luther I didn't know. For those of you who don't know, Eric Metaxas is a Christian author who writes nonfiction books centered around certain characters in the Christian lore that are popular, like Martin Luther, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like some of the founding fathers. And he kind of dispels myths about the character. This book is extremely well researched. Just don't be turned away by it just because he's a Christian author. You really need to read this book because it is excellent. Even if you're not a Christian, I think you'll find lots of interesting things of value. Martin Luther's an interesting guy. And even the things that we have been told in school, he dispelled some of those things. It's like, oh, I was told Martin Luther did this. I was told he nailed his 95 Thesis. I was told he nailed that to the door of the church with a hammer, and you got that famous painting. There's no evidence to prove that happened, and if it did, it wasn't to be out of defiance. It was because the door was literally just the church bulletin board, and that's where your announcements went. At that time, Martin Luther had nothing but respect for the church, and he meant it as respectfully as possible. Now, later on, Martin Luther might have done something like that, but at this point in his life, he really didn't. Martin Luther is a really interesting character, someone who stood up for God, even though all of his friends told him he was wrong, even though everyone was turning their back against him, even though he became essentially an enemy of the state and the papacy. He stood up for his church and started the Reformation, and he split up and created his own church, and the Christian church would not be what it is today if Martin Luther did not stand up to the evils that the Catholic Church was committing back in the day, like trying to get people to basically pay their way into heaven and relieve their ancestors' suffering inside of purgatory. And obviously it was a scam. Pope had really bad spending habits, and he needed a way to pay it off, and they also needed a way to pay for the war going on against the Muslims at the time, so they scammed the people into giving them money because they didn't believe they could raise it any other way. And Martin Luther did not like the fact that people were being scammed and didn't like the fact that people were lying in the name of God and using doctrines that were not Christian and were not from God's word. And it's a great book. Highly recommend. Highly recommend, because this book was fantastic. Next book on the list is actually Berserk, Volume 1 by, I'm going to butcher this, by the way, Kentaro Miru, I believe is how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. My first manga I've ever read probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world to start with. I mean, those of you who know anything about Berserk is pretty bizarre. But I will say, despite that, I don't regret reading it. I think Berserk is actually extremely fascinating. It's a really tightly written story with really good character work. I literally bought this forever ago and didn't read it for the longest time, and then randomly as I was cleaning my bookshelf, I picked it up and started flipping through the pages and read it in a single setting because it was that enticing. And the artwork is fantastic. It just makes the action and violence and everything else that happens in the story just so much more visceral and just really detailed. And the book is great. Kind of interesting to see that a story this well written in this sort of medium that I've heard people all over the place daring to call it one of the greatest stories ever written, and I'm like, I don't know about that. And then I read it, and the more I think about it, it's like, yeah, Berserk is pretty excellent, and that's from only reading this. I don't know if it's one of the greatest stories ever written. I'd have to read more of it because I've only engaged in this little of the story because there's so much more content than just this one book. But I would definitely check out more of Berserk because this first one was downright excellent. It's dark, it's violent. You could argue some of it is quote-unquote tasteless, but I don't know that I would, right? Because I've read some like Zalard and stuff like that, and some really dark, demented, gross stuff. But what makes this book so unique is that it doesn't, I don't think it's necessarily tasteless because it's trying to explore the mental and psychological implications and even spiritual implications of these really dark subject matter. It is not just because it's an edgy, kill everything, look at all the gore and the way people get dismembered book. It's surprisingly, shockingly thoughtful. It is not just an edgy Zack Snyder-y kind of thing. The author really thought about this story, and he wrote something that I think is, you'll be surprised if you've never really read a manga just how, or if you've ever read this story before, it might shock you just how thoughtful it is. Another book I have on the list is Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. Now this is very small for an Eric Metaxas book. Martin Luther and his other books are huge. Letter to the American Church is a lot like Big Trouble Ahead, where he talks about how the American church is going to have to start actually standing up for what they believe, even if we get some flack for it, because you can't just sit here and allow evil to run amok in the church and bad things to happen in your society when you have a responsibility to stand up for what is right, stand up for what is good, and say something about it. the way Bonhoeffer did. Bonhoeffer gave a harrowing prophecy at the Lutheran Church in Germany. The rise of Nazism was growing in the country, and the Lutheran Church thought if they just ignored the Nazis, maybe, like, and just focused on themselves, right, and what they were doing, and what the Lutheran Church wanted to accomplish in their section of the world, you know, just you guys stay over there, we'll stay over here kind of deal. They thought the Nazis would just go away and just wouldn't be a problem anymore. Bonhoeffer stands up and in the Lutheran Church, and he condemns them. He says, no, we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to stand up for what is right. The Nazis are out there, and the things they're preaching are extremely dangerous, and our country is headed for a road to hell if we do not stop them right now. He was one of the first ones to call out the Nazis publicly. He was eventually, you know, caught up in an assassination plot and all kinds of other stuff. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is really interesting. I cannot wait to read Metaxas' book on Bonhoeffer, because this book super hyped me up for him. It's essentially just a book about standing up for what is right, even when the world is against you and telling you that you shouldn't do it. And that is a message that I think really resonates with me. Next up on the list is another reread, but it's 1984 by George Orwell. What can be said about this book that hasn't been said already? It's downright excellent. It does not feel like it was a book written 70 plus years ago. It feels like it could have been written recently, because it is that well written, that ahead of its time. It's like, I don't know what else to say about it. The book is simply the greatest dystopian fiction novel of all time. I think it's an important book to read and to keep in mind. It's a harrowing tale about what will happen if we do not pay attention to these extremist parties and let them get into power. It is excellent. I would say this book is perfect. I really can't think of anything wrong with this book. It's paced really well. The main character is really interesting. The atmosphere is built up perfectly. The imagery and the prose are beautiful. The characters are great. It has one of the most intense scenes and one of the darkest scenes in any, and it's not like it's extremely violent or anything, but it's just the subject matter in the scene is just so dark. It has one of the darkest scenes, I think, in any book. This book is fantastic and would highly recommend. The book is perfect. Can't think of anything wrong with it. Next book is a book I actually borrowed from the library. It is The Old Man in the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Another book that's a pretty fast read. The Old Man in the Sea is an interesting book. It's kind of hard to explain how I feel about it. I don't want to give too much away because I do think the story is worth reading. It's about an old man who feels that his life is coming to an end and decides to go out alone on the sea to hunt down one last great catch and drag it home, and all of the trials he goes through in that. Simple as that. There's nothing really more to the plot than that. Prose-wise, a lot of people criticize the way Ernest Hemingway writes, and I get the criticisms, and I might even hold them myself. Ernest Hemingway is a very blunt writer. He's blunt to the point, short sentences. The old man did this. The boy said that. Did this, right? It's not very flowery. He's not, you know, Tolstoy, you know, or Tolkien, or Orwell, but I still think he's great. In his own strange way, he kind of transcends what we understand to be narrative prose and what makes good narrative prose. It's interesting how, despite the fact that you can be reading his book and have a full knowledge of the fact that his prose aren't the best, and still, like, put the book down and go, that was kind of excellent, actually. There's something about his book that's just kind of surreal. There's something about reading his book that's just so... It's hard to explain what it was like reading Old Man in the Sea. There was just certain times where it felt like I could feel Ernest Hemingway pouring his heart into this story. There was something he so desperately wanted everyone to know and wanted everyone to see, and something there was a story on his heart he wanted to tell, and it was so personal and it felt so real, despite whatever problems you want to point out in it. And that's what makes The Old Man in the Sea so interesting. It kind of defies all odds. It's a really, really solid book that I think will keep you interested even if you're not a fan of the writing style. Just give it a shot and try to look at the message of what Ernest Hemingway is trying to say. The profundities, what he's trying to say, some of the philosophical ideas that he proffers relating himself to the fish and to the ocean and to everything else, and how essentially I think this is his last story, and I think this is just his way of saying, you know, of trying to come to terms with death, and that's what makes this story so profound is that we're reading Ernest Hemingway coming to terms with death. I believe that is how it works. Another book is an audiobook I listened to called Exactly What to Say by Phil M. Jones, another one that is free on YouTube. I'll link it in the description. There's nothing really to say about this book, ironically, because the title is what it says it is. It's how to talk in business meetings with basic conversations, how to kind of use language to win debates or seal deals in business. The book is, I think, a helpful resource. It's not very long. It is no BS, just straight to the point, gives you everything you need to know, and then it's off on its merry way and it's done. Next up on the list, I read this book to do research for another video that I still plan on making, is the Magna Carta Birth of Liberty by Dan Jones. This book is supposed to be kind of a sequel companion to Dan Jones's other book, The Plantagenets, which I do have. And I also have Ivanhoe, another book about the Plantagenets, although it's fiction. It really got me interested in that period of time, because for the last little bit, the only history books I've been reading is about Martin Luther. Although, to be fair, Martin Luther did kind of get me into Catholic medieval history kind of thing. For the most part, as you've seen with this video, all the other stuff I've been reading has been about Native Americans and the history of the Wild West. But Magna Carta helped get me interested in this, and I bought The Plantagenets by Dan Jones. I plan on reading it because this book was good. This book is really solid. Just like Martin Luther, just like The Last Stand, it dispels some of the myths surrounding the Magna Carta that you might have heard from popular fiction and pop culture. It puts it how it is. There's some misconceptions that we have about the Magna Carta, but it still pays respect to the Magna Carta for being what it was, the birth of liberty. Without the Magna Carta, we would not have had the Declaration of Independence, because they literally used it as a basis. They to the point where I think they literally called it their own Magna Carta. This is one of the first documents that we know of that cement the idea that individual persons have certain unalienable rights that God has given them. Sure, at the time, they kind of the lords that were standing up to King John kind of just meant land-owning lords were the only ones that had these rights. But that idea blossomed into what eventually became the Declaration of Independence and what we understand to be basic human right. The lords might have not intended for that to happen, but it is what happened, and it's a really interesting read. A lot of things you probably didn't know about King John, some things you probably didn't know about the Plantagenet kings, like Richard the Lionheart. I would say it's worth it, especially if you're a kind of person who's really passionate about individual liberty and free speech. Next book on the list, number 34, was Michael Crichton. This is the first book I've read from him, Eaters of the Dead. I hinted at this book earlier when talking about Beowulf. This is Michael Crichton's retelling of Beowulf. The story goes, Michael Crichton essentially liked Beowulf but thought it was boring and bet he could write a more interesting version of the story. No offense, Michael Crichton, but I think Beowulf is better than Eaters of the Dead. The plot essentially goes and is a famous Islamic philosopher, intellectual man that traveled the world and had all these great adventures, essentially goes on an adventure with a couple of Norsemen. The man that he is spending time with is a man named Beowulf, who is essentially a more realistic depiction of Beowulf. And if you've ever seen the movie 13th Warrior, which this is the book that it's basing its narrative off of. I like this book. There's some things in it that are kind of interesting that weren't in the movie, but for the most part, I'm not gonna lie, I saw the movie first. That could have something to do with it, but I'm not gonna lie, I like the movie more. The movie gets that really simple epic hero, let's do this, let's stand up, let's kill these evil cannibals that are harassing this small village, and let's protect the people, right? That's what I like about 13th Warrior, whereas this book really doesn't focus on that. And also this book is kind of written weird. It is kind of written very bluntly and to the nose and to the point, because it is based on Ibn Fadlan. I think that's how you say his name. It's about what he's seeing from his point of view, and it's like his memoir. And that's fine and all, but it's kind of a dry book. And it doesn't really focus on the things that I liked in the movie. And you can say that's good or bad or whatever, but I will say it is a fairly interesting book. Obviously, Michael Crichton is a very smart man who's done a lot of research and put a lot of research into this book, and you can tell it's a very believable book. Right, it is certainly a more realistic depiction of the Beowulf character. It just doesn't really focus on characters and developing characters. It focuses more on plot, so there's not really a lot to attach to when it comes to characters besides the main character, which is something I think the movie did better. Overall, it's a solid 6 or 7. It kind of has the same issue that the Daybreakers had, and even maybe you could argue True Grit. Books that are written in this kind of format, which is odd because War of the Worlds is written in that format, and I think it pulls off it the best so far. I actually think War of the Worlds is the best book that's written in that kind of memoir format. Ultimately, I have to admit I was a little disappointed, but it's a fine book. It's alright. And I actually like the really classic cover that has the Viking little bird on it. That's actually cool. I actually like the cover a lot. I made sure I bought the classic version that actually had the old cover because the new cover sucks. It looks terrible. Next is Free Speech, Penguin Liberty's Free Speech book. It is a book that doesn't really have an author because it's a series of excerpts, papers, federal documents, yada yada yada, about free speech and why it is important to keep free speech, and it kind of shows arguments from both sides regarding what free speech is. But essentially, even though I don't agree with everything that is said in this book, because obviously you're not supposed to, it's supposed to open up a conversation, and obviously the editor, who is Corey Brettschneider, kind of has a left-leaning bias. Despite that, the book is pretty great. I think the book is extremely solid and is a really good case study and a really good resource if you want to talk to people about free speech, about why it is necessary to have free speech, why it is a sacred right, and why we need to protect it at all costs. This book does an excellent job of doing that, and I would highly recommend it. It's an easy read. It has like experts from the Constitution, obviously. Frederick Douglass, Thomas Jefferson, John Milton, John Mills. Actually, no, it doesn't even have anything from Milton. Is it Mills? It's Mills. I get them too mixed up, but though John Milton, Areopagitica could honestly be in this. That's another one. I don't know if that really counts as a book. It's just kind of a speech. Whatever. I didn't write it down. The book is pretty solid. It's just an argument for why we need to keep free speech intact, and a fairly solid argument at that. Highly recommend. Next book I read was another Hamza recommendation, was the 4-Hour Workweek. If you want a book just essentially that kind of builds off of Atomic Habits and EntreLeadership and those kinds of books, this book is a great resource. Essentially, it's just about breaking down all the minutiae, all the really complicated things in your life, and just making it really simple, to the point, and just doing simple methods and trying to make your life easier so you can put less hours into work but still get more work done because you're doing good work. That's what makes this book so unique. It's not an excuse to be lazy like some people think it is, but it's a useful resource, and I would highly recommend it, even if you don't want to do what Tim Ferriss does and just make it where you only work for 4 hours a week, because I don't want to do that. It's still useful. I still would recommend it as a reading companion alongside Dave Ramsey's EntreLeadership. So yeah, would recommend. Solid 8. Next book on the list was another audio book, a short story called To Build a Fire by Jack London. Now, I read this one in high school, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, and it has just really striking imagery and stuff like that. Essentially, the plot of this book is a man goes out into the Yukon, cold Alaskan country with his dog when it's 100, when it's like 75 below zero, and tries to keep from freezing to death, but ultimately fails. And it's basically just one long story about a man freezing to death. It is really, really good. It is the Jack London is a great author. I actually want to check out his other work after reading To Build a Fire again and realizing just how excellent of an author he is. I have never seen an author that knows how to make you feel cold like Jack London does. This is another book that I feel like is super authentic. I feel like Jack London has 100% been to all of the locations he's describing in this book. I feel like he himself has experienced being this cold, or has seen people who were so cold that their hands went like limp on the end of their arms and had to be amputated. This book makes you scared to freeze to death. Like, it makes you scared of the cold. I have never read a book that quite does something like that. And what can I say? It's excellent. The imagery is super vivid. You can get it for free here on YouTube. It's like an hour long. Absolutely listen to it. It's great. So great. And it talks about some things that are a little deeper than that, like instinct versus intellect, the difference between man and beast. Would recommend. The next book on the list was a bit of a tough one for me, and it was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Now, I don't have this book on hand. It was another one I borrowed from the library, read half of, got frustrated, and then gave it back because it took a really long time to read. Longer than it should have taken to read. I did finish it, though, through audiobook, and even then it was kind of hard to sit all the way through because Moby Dick, like, even though it starts off promising, Moby Dick starts off very promising. And I gotta be careful because this is a classic, that has a lot of fans, a lot of people that revere and respect it. Moby Dick just kind of meanders. It just goes places and just feels really unfocused sometimes. I like parts of Moby Dick. There's a lot of, like, really great build-up to Captain Ahab and a lot of great build-up to Moby Dick. And then around the middle, the book stops having a plot. Like, I'm fine with a really stretched out plot, and it's appropriate for this because voyages on sea are very long and, like, tedious, right? But at some point, do we really need so many chapters about just random whale facts and just random things about the sea that really isn't relevant to the plot? Do we need to stop this? You remember Princess Bride? That joke about Princess Bride where Princess Bride would just go, with the original copy, would just go on and on and on and meander about dresses for like 45 pages. That's literally what Moby Dick did. That's literally Moby Dick. Moby Dick stops telling you a story so it can give you a backstory and history on every kind of whale, the difference between sperm whales and how to kill a whale and all kinds of other stuff. It's like, this is great and all. And it'd be fine if it was every now and then, or if it was a couple of chapters. It happens so frequently that I had to stop reading at a point and skipped ahead being like, when are we going to get back to the story? When are we going to get back to Captain Ahab trying, like, almost getting his crew killed specifically so he can kill Moby Dick? And it was just sort of frustrating. The book is like a 6 for me. I like parts of it, I hate parts of it. The book was just kind of dry. And it's not just because it's a classic. You know, I'm reading War and Peace right now. War and Peace is far longer and does not do this much meandering. It does not just go to random things that have no point whatsoever. Everything in Tolstoy's War and Peace, even if it doesn't seem relevant, will eventually be relevant. That's kind of the beauty of his book. But Moby Dick literally stops to tell you things that don't matter, and it's kind of annoying. I think this book is better as an audiobook because it feels like a sailor telling you a story, and I do think some of the characters are good. Captain Ahab, kind of interestingly, kind of hijacks this story in real life as well, because nobody remembers Ishmael. No one even remembers Queequeg, Stubb, or Starbuck, or Tashtego. Everyone remembers Ahab, which is kind of what happens in the book. In narrative, they were just wanting to be whalers, just going on their merry way. They're just doing their job. And Ahab comes on board as the captain of the vessel and basically hypes all of them up to get revenge against Moby Dick and basically steals their mission from them and makes it his own, right? He steals their purpose and inserts his own in their place, which is kind of what Captain Ahab is as a character in real life, because that's the character everyone's always going to remember of this story is Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab has surpassed all the other characters, including Ishmael, who is the main character, and who you often forget is the main character because it's like he's kind of just not a very assertive, protagonist. He's just kind of observing everything. And just like in the story, Ahab has kind of stolen the spotlight and is now, some people would probably read the book thinking he's the main character, but he's not. Characters have a lot of personality, I'll give him that. It's just, I wanted to spend more time with them instead of all of the random facts that I don't care about. Would I recommend it? Sure, but it's definitely not my favorite book of the year. 39 is another reread, and that is Wraiths of the Broken Land by S. Craig Zallar. Finished this one on Christmas. I read this book almost every single year. Those of you who have watched my channel know that I am a huge fan of S. Craig Zallar's work. I love his films, I love his books. I love Bone Tomahawk, I love Brawl and Sublike 99, I love Drive Across Concrete, I even like Asylum Blackout, and his books Congregation of Jackals and Race of the Broken Lands I like particularly because, I like his westerns more than I like his crime stuff, but he's still a great author and a great writer overall. I could talk about this book all day as well. I think this book is like a 10. I love it. I think this book is almost perfect. It's actually kind of incredible how much character work Zallar is able to pull off in this short of a story, and I was able to read it like it was a breeze because I've read it so many times. I was going to read Congregation of Jackals again this year, but Congregation of Jackals, I got 100 pages into it. Not to insult that book, as you guys know, I gave that book lots of praise last year because it deserves it, because it is a great book. It's just really depressing. Even more so than this book is. And that's not to say this book's chipper, but this book has more satisfying character stuff in it. Whereas in Congregation, the entire point of that book is that everyone gets their comeuppance. It's kind of a depressing story, and everyone just ends the story depressingly. But I like Race of the Broken Land more. Race of the Broken Land has scenes that are a lot more satisfying, and even if a character dies, he at least gets to do something cool before he dies. Race of the Broken Lands, I think, might be my favorite S. Craig Zallar thing, other than Bone Tomahawk. I don't know which one I like more, the Bone Tomahawk movie or Wraiths of the Broken Lands. I was hearing talk of a movie that was potentially going to be made. They even had people casted in the movie and stuff like that, but it doesn't seem like the movie's happening anymore. It was going to be directed by Ridley Scott and it was going to be written by S. Craig Zahler himself. He's going to be adapting his own book with Drew Goddard, who wrote The Martian and Daredevil, the show. And I was really excited to see it, but unfortunately it's not going to happen, which is kind of understandable because this is a very, very dark, grim, violent book that would not translate to modern audiences very well. Fantastic. Character work's great. The prose are great. Everything in this book is great. This book is perfect. It's like a 10. I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. I could talk about it all day. Love it. And the last book I read this year, I'm holding this one up again because an excerpt of it is in this book, and that's what got me to read the rest of it, was On Liberty by John Mills. Now, John Mills was one of the authors featured in Penguin Liberty's free speech book, where he was talking about free speech and what the rights of men are and why, as a society, you cannot why it is wrong to deprive man of speech. For people who want a good, argument against people who are just very anti-free speech, because I feel like a lot of reasons why free speech arguments, people are kind of losing free speech arguments, is because they're not really well read on the why we need free speech. They just know it's right, but they don't know how to argue. They don't know how to argue for it. So if you want to know why, read John Mills's work, read John Milton's work, and you will understand what makes free speech so important. It is essentially to the betterment of all of us and to learning. That is how we learn more, is if people have the wrong opinion, if people have wrong views, and we shut them down for that, we are in the wrong. We are actually hurting ourselves because we are keeping ourselves from learning more. Because we cannot trust ourselves so much as to think that we have the 100% right truth all the time, no matter who we are. We have to gauge everyone's opinion, sift through it, combine all the opinions and stuff like that, comb through, take all the garbage out, and eventually we'll arrive to something that is as close to the truth as possible. And to do that, we need both sides talking in a environment where they won't get arrested for it. Yeah, would recommend Mills's work. He's also got an audiobook on YouTube. Yeah, it's 40 bucks. I am kind of blown away. This is the most books I've read in a single year. Usually I didn't get past 7 to 14, and even though I would like to consider myself a pretty avid reader back in the day, it shows what I know. It feels good to have read this many books. It actually feels pretty great to have read this many books in a single year and talk about them, and I feel like I've learned so much this year. I feel like I'm much more well-read than I've ever been, instead of pretending to be well-read just so people on the internet would like me. It feels like I actually know things. It feels like I've actually learned something, and I think that's great. Absolutely, I think you should look into reading more. I think it is important to read as many books as possible, and I also believe that it's healthy to cut certain other medias out in order to make more time for reading. Reading 40 books isn't as hard as it looks, though I do want to make a video. I think I will make a video about how I was able to read. Tell me what you think of these, if you've read any of these, in the comments down below. I won't make too many promises, but I will try to return, and I will try to make more content for this channel, and I will try to write more books to publish myself here soon. Books that will kind of be better than the ones that I've already published. That's really all I've got for you guys today. I hope you all have a lovely day. I hope you have a blessed day, and I will see you later.